I would like to introduce our speaker for today. His name is Dr. Peter Raven. He is a distinguished scientist at the Missouri Botanical Garden. He is going to talk about fitting sustainable agriculture into the global environment. And Dr. Raven is President Emeritus of the Missouri Botanical Garden, which he headed for 39 years. And he has guided this organization to becoming a global leader in botanical garden research and conservation. And for many years, he's also been a leader in the effort to attain global sustainability, which he'll talk about today.
Hello, everyone. It's a great pleasure to be able to address you, and I'm so glad that distant imaging made this all possible, distant connections. What I want to stress today a little bit are the reviews that we went through for the meeting of the Entomological Society of America here in St. Louis in November. Some of you may have attended it, and it is, the papers there are headed for a special section in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences within the next 3 months that I'm sure will be distributed. Insects are kind of a beacon as to what's going on in the world, and of course there's been a lot of argument as to whether modern agriculture or any agriculture disturbs them, destroys them, or lowers their numbers. You know, I was born in 1936 when there were about 2.2 billion people in the world. There are about 7.7 billion people in the world now, headed for near 10 billion in the next 30 years. We are cultivating with crops about 12% of the world's land surface and grazing another 30%, mostly unsustainably, throughout the world. Human beings and our domestic mammals, the ones that we grow for eating and for milk and so forth, are about 95% of the total biomass of mammals in the world. All of the wild mammals, all of the elephants and tigers and lions and mice and everything else are about 5% of the total biomass on the earth. Now, given that, I will begin by saying it would be an incredible miracle, in fact, impossible, if the number of insects in the world and the amount of ecosystem resilience and the number of species of everything would not be declining rapidly. There's simply no way that a rapidly growing 7.8 billion people could be fit into the earth, cultivating and grazing 40% of it, changing the climate of the earth, and we'll get back to that a little bit later, without causing extinctions. It's sort of like the arguments about monarch butterflies. We correctly or logically, and I'll get back to the logic of this too in a little bit, clean the weeds out of our fields, and then we say, well, the milkweeds that were in the fields for monarch butterflies are not there, so the numbers are falling. One of the silliest things that you could do is to argue that the numbers of insects in the world are not falling, or that extinction is not rampant in the world, or that agriculture did not have a major role in it. The most important thing that you can do, and what you're in a brilliant position to be able to do, and what you are doing, is to teach us all to practice agriculture that will be resilient and sustainable and can be as productive as it can be on the smallest possible piece of the Earth's surface. By doing that, you'll be making a unique contribution to preserving biodiversity in the world. Why should we care about preserving biodiversity in the world? Why should we care about ecosystems? Well, the reason is very simple, and I'll review this and historically in a minute. The ecosystems in the world, the biological systems in the world, evolved over the about 4 billion years of life on Earth, on this planet, but when they started about 10% through the history of the planet. And those ecosystems gradually, and the activities of photosynthetic organisms in them, gradually led to production of the atmosphere, that we breathe, the atmosphere that allowed, by blocking ultraviolet rays from the sun, that allowed the ancestral terrestrial organisms, which would be insects, fungi, plants, terrestrial vertebrates, to come up on Earth about 400 million years ago, which was already about 90% of the way through the history of the Earth. The atmosphere that they created is the one that we breathe. It went from virtually no oxygen to about 20% oxygen as a result of the activities of living organisms. It began to block the ultraviolet rays that otherwise would have caused breaks and mutations in the nucleic acid of the organisms that were becoming terrestrial. And by doing that, it would have made our life impossible. In other words, we depend on the activities of those ecosystems. We depend on the continuing activities of those ecosystems to maintain the quality of the atmosphere and the composition of the atmosphere. We depend on them to control water cycles on the Earth, to control the climate. We depend on them to determine local weather, which they do very definitely. And the destruction of Amazon forests, for example, is particularly disturbing in that it may destroy the local weather cycles and the weather of that area. We depend on them for guarding topsoil, and we depend on them, very importantly in our age, for absorbing pollutants. One of those pollutants is carbon dioxide. Now, the global ecosystem is not some kind of magical quantity that stands out there by itself, but it's composed of many interacting organisms which are interacting in a very intricate way. We know that the activities of those organisms are what drive it and what allow it to keep maintaining our atmosphere, absorbing as much as possible of our pollutants, conserving the soil, controlling water cycles and climates. We know we depend on the interactions between organisms. What we don't know is how many organisms we can knock off before the ecosystems become unable to continue their services, which are vital to our existence. In fact, instead of talking about human beings and ecosystems, we should remember that we're actually a part of those ecosystems, one of many millions, and I'll get back to that also, one of many millions of kinds of organisms that occur on Earth, and we are in them and of them. On the matter of how many organisms can become extinct before they collapse, we're running a major experiment to find that out now, unfortunately. My friends Paul and Ann Ehrlich, I think, made an enlightening analogy of this by saying that the subtraction of species from ecosystems would be like if you're looking out the wing of an airplane, you see somebody out there popping rivets out of the sheets of metal on the wing, and he pops out a few and the wing's still there and all. The question would be, how many can he pop out before the wing falls off and ceases to function? We don't really know, and ecology as a whole is a very recent kind of science, really not more than 100 years old, and is at a very primitive state of development. As we learn about it, we'll get a better sense of that. But meanwhile, popping the rivets just because we can see short-term profit in doing so is not a very good idea. Now, in the history of human beings on Earth, humans are basically African apes. We split off the other African apes about 6 to 8 million years ago in Africa and began the evolutionary path, which of course is much discussed since it's of great interest to us, that led to the appearance of our species, Homo sapiens, about 300,000 years ago. Our species originated in Africa for sure and got to the Northern Hemisphere no less than about 70,000 years ago. Earlier hominids, earlier members of our evolutionary branch, got to the Northern Hemisphere much earlier, Homo erectus and Neanderthal man and Denisovans, but they didn't ever reach the levels or the impact that our species Homo sapiens has, which is why we focus on it. Reaching the Eurasia about 70,000 years ago, Homo sapiens began to migrate, and hominids for the first time reached Australia about 70,000 years ago, and they reached the New World, North America, no less than about 17,000 years ago. It could have been more, but massive signs of people in the New World are all from about 17,000 years ago or more recent. You realize these times we're talking about are just a very small slice, even in the history of hominids, much less in the history of life on Earth. Once Homo sapiens, that is, had reached North America, our ancestors cruised south and in a few thousand years got all the way to the southern tip of South America. Our ancestors in Western Asia probably began to practice agriculture only about 11,000 years ago. And when they began to practice agriculture, the global population of Homo sapiens is estimated at about 1 million people. That is about the same as the population of a small city at the present time. And the population of Europe is estimated at about 100,000 people. In other words, the population of Europe at the invention of agriculture about 11,000 years ago could have fit into a large sports stadium today. With their invention of agriculture and of crop agriculture and the domestication of animals, our ancestors were able to produce food and store food to tide themselves over winters and periods of drought and other unfavorable seasons. And when they did, then they could essentially for the first time form towns and villages and cities, and their numbers began to build rapidly, being made possible by their discovery of agriculture. By the time of the Roman Empire, there were about 200 million of us, about 60 million of whom were in the Roman Empire. By the beginning of the Renaissance, about 500 years ago, there were about 500 million of us. And it took until Napoleonic times, about 300 years later, for our population to reach 1 billion people for the first time, then 2 billion people in 1927. And from then, our population has shot up rapidly to its present 7.7 billion people, increasing rapidly. One of the most important things I'm going to suggest for you today is to consult Global Footprint Network, which you can Google, GFN, and see what it says about the use, our use, human beings' use today of this potentially sustainable consumption of the earth. Economic models are unfortunately often based on the fact that natural productivity, biological productivity, is like any other kind of commodity that's used in ecological models, and the more we use, the more it will produce. Unfortunately, nothing could be farther from the truth. The total sustainable productivity of the earth, our ancestors were using about 2/3 of it in about 1970, about 60%, let's say, in about 1950, when the United Nations was started. And at present, we're estimated to be using about 175% of total potentially sustainable productivity. 175% means that by about August 1st of each year, we've used all of the sustainable productivity that's available in the world, and we're basically eating into the principle of our account of sustainable productivity. It's called Overshoot Day. Global Overshoot Day is the day we pass that. And of course, that's not a situation that can go on. What is even more threatening about the current situation is the vast inequality between nations. While the United States can produce a surplus agriculturally, and whereas Europe, although countries like Belgium are among the most productive in the world, can mostly get by on importing agricultural productivity, we are using in the United States, Western Europe, and Japan far more biological productivity than the world can produce. If everybody in the world was living at the level of the United States or Western Europe, we need about 4 copies of the planet Earth to sustain us, and we haven't got those. On the other end of the spectrum, in the poorest nations of the world, many of them in Africa, are facing what we call an environmental pit, an environmental fall into a pit, an environmental disaster, which will gradually, which makes it impossible for them to produce enough to feed themselves or to supply their other needs. And they're basically victims of the rest of the world, which is scraping off their productivity and bringing it here. That extraordinary degree of inequality, exactly what Adlai Stevenson was decrying in his famous 1964-65 Spaceship Earth speech to the United Nations, that gross inequality makes a world that can't remain in balance. In other words, we can't go on making America great again by scraping up everything inside, and poor nations can't ever using up more than they can actually produce, and their incomes failing, can't really put themselves on a sustainable pathway. The kind of research that Bayer does in agriculture, of course, can very much contribute to the sustainability of both the productive agriculture in the United States, Western Europe, and Japan, and the failing agriculture in very badly depleted Africa. And I should pause for a minute there and say Africa should be a matter of special concern to you, because there are about 1.1 billion people in sub-Saharan Africa now, projected to be 2.2 billion people in 30 years by 2050, 2.2 billion, more than doubling, and 4.4 billion people by the end of the century. Now, some will say population is beginning to level off, for example, in India, where the 1.3 billion people will have another 500 million added by mid-century. But the problem is that growth in populations depends on the number of young people in the population pyramid, in the growth pyramid for that country, and it can't level off that quickly. It could level off by the end of the century by current projections, if we do several important things, which I'll mention later on. It could level off, but if it does, we certainly could not be consuming at the level that we are in the United States, even though in kind of a subconscious way, I think that's what we're all imagining, youth dividends in Africa and all, leading to happy times and productivity, leading to everybody living like we do in the United States. But no, it's not really going to happen. The spread of agriculture, of course, throughout the world proceeded rapidly once it began. We used to think that agriculture began to spread to Europe peacefully, but now we believe that, like human beings often do, the agriculturists from Western Asia swept into Europe, beat up or killed the people who were there, and introduced agriculture in the various parts of Europe gradually, after having invented it where they were. The problem is that as agriculture spread, people began to cut forests and change natural communities. And by about 3,000 years ago, they had done so in the Mediterranean region, for example. The Mediterranean region is basically shaped by the destruction So the Mediterranean was cleaned out very early in the search for agricultural lands and really attained its present appearance about 3,000 years ago, which is when forests were largely cleared on a wide basis throughout Eurasia. The extinction rates of species sort of paralleled the expansion of agriculture and the growth in human population. And we can estimate the extinction rates of species by looking at the fossil record of species with hard parts like vertebrates and mollusks from after the last major extinction, the famous one that when the dinosaurs bit the dust 66 million years ago, and then comparing that with current rates that we see in the same groups. And they show that extinction rates have risen by about 1,000 times. They were about 1/10 per 1,000 per year 50 million years ago, and they're about 100 per 1,000 per year now, per million per year now. So extinction is proceeding very rapidly, and taking into account the estimates that conservation groups like the International Union for the Conservation of Nature and Natural Resources have made, about 20% of all the species in the world are in danger of extinction in the next several decades, and probably twice that many by the end of the century. In other words, we're quite clearly, according to the great majority of scientists, have already entered the 6th major extinction event that the world has ever experienced. That's not really surprising when you consider the pressure that we're putting on global ecosystems with our very large numbers of people, and most importantly, and please do check Global Footprint Network, our tremendous pressure on the resources that the world has. Now, if we turn specifically to what's happening to insects, which I know is a special matter of interest to you, there are a number of papers in Europe that are documenting extinction very well in the same places. Whether that extinction is measured by biomass or in terms of number of species. The one study in England that said that biomass was more or less constant is matched by other studies which say that the number of species is declining rapidly. And agriculture, the spread of agriculture and the practice of better and better agriculture is closely linked to the decline in species numbers in both California and Ohio. Some papers in Europe have put the decline in numbers of species back as much as 2 centuries, but obviously it's been a progressive thing. And as the character of agriculture has changed and as our numbers and demand have increased, that loss has understandably sped up. As I said, if you really consider our pressure on the earth and the pressure of agriculture and the spread of agriculture and of grazing and of pollution and of all the other things we do, it would be an absolute miracle if insect numbers and numbers of other organisms were not decreasing. So I think it's very important that if you're trying to defend the use of more precise agriculture, defend it by talking about genetic precision, which helps to eliminate the need for fertilizers and for pesticides, such as BT corn, for example, maize. And in doing that, you're saving the conditions for species and saving the ecosystems that are operating mixed with the crops. In Europe, of course, since World War II, the virtual elimination of hedges, the widespread elimination of hedges, the cleaner and cleaner maintenance of the fields, and a variety of other pressures have helped to lower the number of insect species virtually everywhere. The traditional fields in Europe used to hold a great deal more biodiversity, but any effort to make them more productive is likely to lower it. What's said about pesticides being held within the fields and not having effects, of course, is true, but they do drift, and there is a consequence to that. When you consider the almost complete conversion of the Central Valley of California to agriculture, for example, again, it would be miraculous. It would be quite impossible to suppose that biodiversity in the Central Valley of California stayed where it was. There have been a number of documented reports of the declines in numbers of wild bees. And of course, that is not only difficult in terms of the ecosystems of which they're a part, they also play a beneficial role in agriculture, and their loss is therefore something to look at from a standpoint of productivity alone. The insectivorous birds that live in grasslands have, of course, also declined rapidly during this great growth and expansion of productivity in agriculture. And it's clear that this is pretty much a worldwide phenomenon. BirdLife International has measured it in many different places. And although all birds are decreasing in number for the reasons that we've talked about in general, insectivorous birds that live in grasslands are decreasing most rapidly. The situation in the tropics is particularly interesting. The tropics are being converted more rapidly than any of us usually pay attention to for agriculture. Of course, different kinds of agriculture. Oil palm is one very important reason, but there are they're in the tropics, in the drier tropics of Brazil, the Cerrado. The production of soybeans is an important reason. And as those lands are cleared, biodiversity around them is bound to get to be less. Again, if you take the major convention that was passed to protect biodiversity worldwide, the Convention on Biological Diversity that came out of the famous Rio Conference in 1991 and was ratified in 1993. So it's about a quarter of a century old. And that was supposedly a global effort to protect biodiversity worldwide, and with individual nations ratifying it, in other words, pledging to plans to protect biodiversity. About 1/4 of all tropical forests in the world have been cut since that was passed. And of course, the more forests are cut in the tropics, the less biodiversity there is, and the less well those ecosystems function. With the rapid decline in the Amazon, caused partly by climate change, which I'll stress in a minute, with the rapid decline in the Amazon forest, the Congo forest, and the forests of Southeast Asia, there are very few experts anywhere in the world who think that there will be any significant amounts of forest left in those three regions by the end of the century. With 1/4 of all the forests there having been destroyed in the biologically richest part of the world since the passage of the treaty that we depend on to protect them, it's pretty obvious that international cooperation there is no better than, and indeed worse than it is for global warming, where it's been really ineffectual. One ecosystem very much at risk through climate change, which is yet another phenomenon, are of course the cloud forests of the Andes in the New World tropics and the similar vegetation types, that is cooler, moister vegetation types that lie up the mountains above the lowland tropical forests. Those are being changed rapidly by climate change. Dan Jansen of the University of Pennsylvania and the Guanacaste Protection Area in Costa Rica, at the symposium that I referred to at the onset, showed dramatic images on the one hand of the tremendous decline in insect numbers and insect biomass at light traps that were set in exactly the same places over the last 25 years, also in the number of species. And then going along with that, he showed over the last 25 years pictures taken of the cloud covers of those forests on particular days over the past 25 years, and the difference is just stunning. where there were thick cloud forests bringing moisture, bringing moisture to those forests 25 years ago. There are basically none now. They're out in the full sun. Two of the world crops that are grown in vegetation types like that, and which therefore will be at considerable risk, are tea and coffee. And that means for an agricultural company that improvements in tea and coffee to grow in less mild circumstances than they have grown are going to be very important. The whole tea industry of India is in forests and climates like the ones that Janssen has been measuring carefully in Costa Rica. And if we're going to go on producing large amounts of tea and coffee in the world, it's going to depend on genetic improvements, genetic changes in those crops to make them still functional in the future. If we want to cope with the destruction of ecosystems and the tremendous loss of biodiversity worldwide, there are a number of things that we are doing and can do, and I'll review these briefly to give you an idea. One of the major ways that we depend on is the production of parks and other reserved areas worldwide. And there's a goal set by Ed Wilson, a conservation biologist, ecologist of Harvard University, of half Earth, in other words, preserving the vegetation on half of the Earth. With the kinds of economic forces going worldwide, with the kinds of drag by the rich countries of productivity from the poor countries, it becomes kind of wishful thinking to suppose that the poor countries, where people are largely busy trying to feed their families, are going to be able to maintain either protected species or protected areas very well without our help. How much does a country like the United States care about Africa? Well, how much did we care about the Rwanda-Burundi crisis? How much help have we given? How much do we give to try to level off agricultural productive systems in Africa? Very, very little. And yet, as Adlai Stevenson did bring out so long ago, the world either survives or fails as a whole, and it will be very important to try to provide aid as well as better agricultural systems in order to improve productivity in the poorer areas of the world where food is really lacking. In doing that, we will be helping to protect the parks and reserves that I talked about a minute ago. It is basically disgusting that people are still arguing about whether GMOs are dangerous or not, but I don't need to preach to the converted about that. They're doing that obviously because of an ignorance of science and unwillingness to accept science, and therefore the application of thinking, contrary thinking that will basically make agriculture less productive than it might be otherwise, drive many people to starvation, and help agriculture and cause agriculture to spread out into areas that are not already cultivated, thus adding to the cycle of destruction that I've already talked about. A number of interesting experiments are being run at Iowa State and other places about the effects of including strips of vegetation or strips of trees, lines of trees in agricultural fields in the Midwest. And they're basically showing that this can be done with very little loss in productivity. And I hope that Bayer will continue to encourage any kind of experimentation that will vary the fields, maintain the productivity high, and still give a whole environment, a whole ecosystem in which the agriculture can take place. When it comes to climate change, we've got another very awful problem. And as I already mentioned, the degree of synergy, the degree of cooperation between the countries of the earth to limit or turn back climate change is pitiful so far. One very reputable worker, Ramanathan of San Diego State, University of California, San Diego, has calculated that we could be on a track to a 3 degrees Celsius increase in temperature over the next 30 years if we don't get very busy with climate change reduction in this decade to which we've already entered. Agriculture needs to respond to climate change, and obviously you're doing many things to try to figure out how to respond to climate change. But unless the nations of the world will cooperate and do things like limit the burning of fossil fuels, eliminate the burning of fossil fuels, increase sustainable agriculture, and for reasons that have been well detailed elsewhere, that doesn't mean going out cutting down trees and burning them, because you lose the capacity of the trees to sequester carbon dioxide when you do that. That means really looking at systems that gather more carbon dioxide, that capture more carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases. And of course, those systems include agricultural systems, as you're well aware, depending on how they're laid out, depending on no-till, depending on a lot of other things. Agricultural systems can either capture a lot of the gases or not capture a lot of the gases. In order for the nations of the world to really get together in limiting climate change, we're going to need a degree of cooperation we just haven't got. And I would hope that a worldwide company like Bayer might realize that, and realize that markets of the future, opportunities of the future, anything in the future is going to depend on reining in climate change. About 10 years ago, I convened a seminar at Washington University, brought in people from around the country to consider climate change in the Midwest and what the effects might be on agriculture. And we concluded very easily that the climate in the Midwest would be about like the climate in northern Georgia now, unless we did something about it, and to consider that no matter how facile and how dedicated, how well defined our efforts to improve the genetics of crops may be, cultivating corn and soybeans in the climate of northern Georgia is very different from cultivating corn and soybeans in the climate that we have today. One of the things that the World Wildlife Fund Agricultural Division is looking at is, where is the California of the future going to be? There's little hope that California, given the degree of climate change that we've already generated, and which will go on to a certain extent no matter what we do, can go on to produce the crops that it's producing now, and for which we depend on California. It may be that the climate of Missouri could be a climate where crops like those in California could be grown. And the latest iteration of that search that I've seen was that the Delta, the southern Mississippi Valley, might be an area like California that might take those crops up. While you're working to improve crops' reaction to climate change, we as citizens, we as corporate entities, we as nations have got to keep working to stop the whole process too, because something like a 3 degree Celsius increase in climate will change the character of agriculture so substantially that there's absolutely no way we can keep up with it, and no way that we can keep agricultural enterprise as productive as it is now. The countries of the world have got to learn to cooperate with and work with one another. And I would really call on you all, being spread out internationally, operating internationally and so forth, to do what you can to help in that cooperation, which is very much in your corporate interest as well as in the interest of all people on earth. I think that I've said enough. Perhaps allow a little time for questions, and the paper that I've basically digested this from will be available in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences, along with other papers on similar matters in the fairly near future. Thank you.